Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, joins us. Former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO and former head of Southern Command. Admiral Stav, welcome back. Good to see you. I hope, Admiral, you got ready for a rapid fire. There's a lot of stories. I want to start with this one. China Coast Guard boards Taiwan tourist boat. It's in the Financial Times yesterday. Hadn't made the American press yet. Raising concerns Beijing could seize upon a nearby incident to establish full control of waters near the Chinese coast. What do you make of this?
Very worrisome. I saw the stories. We'll have to learn a little more about what exactly happened here. But there are two big things I'm watching in Asia right now. One is, how is China going to respond to the election of William Lai, the new president-elect of Taiwan? He'll be inaugurated in a couple of months. He is not the preferred candidate of China. So China is probably going to do a number of things in cyber, perhaps this kind of harassment of vessels moving in between the islands. They may harass the small Taiwanese islands that are close to the coast. So we need to be watching that space closely. Worrisome. The other one I'm really worried about, Hugh, and you don't hear enough about it, is the Philippines and the way in which China is very aggressively going after the Filipino Navy as they try and replenish some of their ships, some of their small bases. Gets complicated quickly, but in the midst of all of our focus on Taiwan, we ought to be watching closely how hard is China pushing in the South China Sea on Filipino assets, because unlike Taiwan, where we have decision space, we are a bound treaty ally of the Philippines. If they get into a war with China, we're in a war with China. So those are both.
Admiral, that raises a question. For years, we've had Tripwire Troops at the DMZ, which is intended to engage us in any war that the North Koreans start. We've also got this kind of useless ship, the LCS, and I know there's a lot of pride in the crews and the captains who've got the LCS out there, but it's not exactly going to win any awards for great acquisition. Why don't we just park some of those in the Philippines and Taiwan? They don't have much of a mission, but they could be pretty good tripwires, couldn't they?
I think that's a very good suggestion. And those ships are, you are correct, they are not prepared to be in high-end combat, but they could be in a tripwire status, a surveillance status, a bolster your allies kind of status. And the other pair that could be attached to that, Hugh, would be Coast Guard cutters, the national security cutters. Again, a lot of experience operating in these shallow waters, small drafts. So I like the idea of Coast Guard engagement with the Filipino Navy. I'll go it one further and agree with you this morning. Good mission for LCS.
All right. Well, then I hit a home run. I'm done for the day. No, I'm not done. I want to bring this up next. Also from the Financial Times, crew abandons ship in most damaging strike yet by Yemen's Houthis. So we have not deterred them. We can continue to do, I don't like the financial exchange. When we shoot down one of their drones, we're using a pretty expensive missile or anti-ship missile device. How long and what else can we do?
First and foremost, we need to break the supply lines coming from Iran to the Houthis. And that is easy to say on the Hugh Hewitt show. It's hard to do, but we have got to begin to go after the supply chains, because you are correct, simply plinking away at the ability of the Houthis to launch a missile or two so far is not having the intended effect. So that means cutting those supply chains. You can do that at sea most easily with our naval vessels that are there. Iran is kind of shipping a lot of spare parts. They break down these missiles and move the parts in. The next step would be to go to the Iranian offload sites. Now you're getting very controversial. And of course, at the far end of that supply chain, you could go after the production facilities themselves in Iran. We're not there yet, but what we're doing is not having the intended effect. We're going to have to amp it up.
Now, Admiral, a lot of people had you tipped to be Secretary of State for Secretary Clinton had she won her president's thing and for something. And now you're heading the Rockefeller Foundation. You're perfectly fine. Nevertheless, you're a diplomat, so I'm going to ask you an undiplomatic question. What in the world is the Biden team thinking about drafting a ceasefire resolution when you can't leave Hamas in Rafah? I mean, you just can't leave Hamas in Rafah, can you?
No, you cannot leave Hamas in Rafah. I was focused this morning on the comments from General Benny Gantz, former General Chief of Defense of the Israeli Defense Forces, when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I know him well. He's a steady, moderate voice in the war cabinet. He would tell you that we have to continue the march into Rafah. There's no other way around it. Now, equally true, the big we, the global we have to work with the Israelis to try and protect as much and as many of the civilians, the 1.1 million who are packed in there. I see three things that can be done. Number one, we need to put more pressure on Egypt to open up their border in a measured, controlled way, financially supported by the Gulf Arabs, EU, US. We can spread that cost and put a humane refugee camp on that side of the border where the Gazans can go until they go back. At the end of the day, these are small numbers. Egypt's population is huge. This would be 1 million or two Gazans. Sounds like a lot, but look at Syria. There are millions of Syrians in UN-controlled camps outside the Syrian border waiting for that civil war to be over. So that's one way to protect civilians. Number two, the Israelis are doing this, and civilian casualties have declined about 75% since their peak overall, still too high, but declining. But corridors, protected zones inside Gaza, very difficult. The Israelis can manage that. It'll reduce their overall throw weight of military effectiveness, but I think that's a reasonable trade-off that can be expected. And then third and finally, the way in which the Israelis go into Rafah matters. They can't simply aerial bomb it into submission because of the civilians who are there. This is going to have to be a fairly precise kind of operation to include going after the tunnel complex. I've said since October 7th, the center of gravity here are those tunnels. They have to be decommissioned. There's 400 miles of them. This area under Rafah is the last stronghold underground, and you're showing some good video of it now. 400 miles. It's got to be eliminated. That's another major reason Israel ultimately will go into Rafah.
So, Admiral, did you see the story about, and there is no name attached to it, State Department officials and people who requested anonymity saying, we're going to put this UN ceasefire resolution before the Security Council? I was just kind of stunned. That's not what we do to our allies when they've been invaded. I mean, I don't think there's a precedent for it. Were you surprised to see that story?
Yes, I am surprised. As you know, there's deep frustration in various elements in the White House about the Israeli approach. And a lot of it is well-meaning criticism of the Israelis in the sense that there's a long-term global narrative that's developing here that is extremely negative for Israel. So people who consider themselves strong friends of Israel have, and I think will continue to advise the Israelis to reduce the level of violence, exactly as we just talked about. Two things can be true at the same time. You may have to attack and destroy Hamas. You've got to protect the civilian population. But to answer your question directly, the idea of floating a mandatory ceasefire from the UN, I don't think is the right approach. I think we still...
I thought it was a trial balloon that just had to be shot down. Quick closing question, Admiral. The Saudis and the Emiratis tried for many years to shut down the Houthis. I'm not sure if it was their level of competence or our level of restraint imposed on them that stopped that from working. Do we expect a renewal of actual war in Yemen?
Nobody wants that, including the Houthis, including the Saudis, and including us. What we would like is for the Houthis to go back to a ceasefire there, let diplomacy try and sort out the complex civil war that's going on inside Yemen, and to reopen those shipping lanes. So, are we headed toward a full scale war there? I would say if the Houthis don't wake up and smell the tea, this kind of combat directed against us is going to against them is going to be a whole new level beyond what Saudi Arabia and the UAE could provide. And by the way, as we started the conversation, we have other cards to play going further back in that supply chain, all the way to Iran if we have to. Iran knows that. Let's hope Iran exerts appropriate pressure on the Houthis, open the shipping lanes, let diplomacy take its course in Yemen.
Last quick question, Admiral. Navalny was murdered by Putin. I have a new column up at Fox News about Karl Murza, who is the next guy up on Putin's kill list inside of the Soviet Union, inside of Russia. Is there anything we can do, or does just raising this, just if Biden brings up Karl Murza, I'm afraid Putin will kill him just to spite Biden. What do you think?
I think that we ought to raise these issues, continue to talk about them. And frankly, it's time to further expel Vladimir Putin from the world stage. So, how do we do that? Because half the world has already done it. But we need to be working off camera with Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, India. The global South needs to wake up to the behavior of this monster. And he truly is a monster, Vladimir Putin.
I agree. And we should disintermediate his money. I'll tell a story after the break about that. Admiral Stav, always good to see you. Follow him on X at Stavridis J.